You don't hear the shot. That's the first thing nobody tells you. You're moving through a hedgerow in Normandy, France, summer of 1944. The air is thick with the smell of cut grass and something older, something that hasn't moved in a long time. The hedgerow on your left is 8 feet tall, packed earth and roots so dense that a tank can barely push through it. The hedgerow on your right is the same. You are in a corridor with no ceiling and no exit. And somewhere ahead of you, behind a wall of green you cannot see through, there are men who have been waiting for you since before sunrise. Your squad is 12 men. You are moving toward a farm field that looks exactly like the last farm field, which looked exactly like the one before that. Every field in Normandy looks the same in July 1944. Every field is a potential killing ground. And the man walking 3 steps to your left, the one carrying the Browning automatic rifle, the bar, he is already dead. He just doesn't know it yet. Because somewhere out there, behind the roots and the centuries-old Norman earth, a German sniper is looking through a scope. He has been trained, drilled, and ordered to perform one task before anything else: identify the man with the automatic weapon and eliminate him first. Always first. Without exception. This is the story of why. If you find this kind of tactical history as compelling as I do, the decisions behind the decisions, the doctrine that determined who lived and who died, subscribe and hit the bell. We go deep on every story. Now let's go back to Normandy. To understand why German snipers had standing orders to kill the bar gunner first, you have to understand what the bar was and what it wasn't. It wasn't a machine gun. Not technically. It was an automatic rifle. The M1918A2 Browning automatic rifle, designed by the legendary American firearms engineer John Moses Browning and first fielded in the final weeks of World War I. By World War II, it had been refined into a weapon that fired the powerful .30-06 Springfield cartridge, the same round used in the M1 Garand, at a cyclic rate of 300 to 650 rounds per minute, depending on the setting. It weighed just under 20 pounds fully loaded. One man could carry it, one man could run with it, one man could sprint across an open field and lay down fire that, to anyone on the receiving end, felt like the front edge of a storm. Here's what that meant in practice. The standard American rifle squad in World War II had 12 men. 10 of them carried M1 Garand rifles. Excellent weapons, semi-automatic, accurate, reliable. The 11th carried ammunition. And the 12th man, the BR gunner, carried the only fully automatic weapon in the entire squad. He was, functionally, the squad's engine. American infantry doctrine was built on fire and movement. You suppress the enemy so your men can maneuver. You move so your men can suppress. Back and forth, leapfrogging across contested terrain, always keeping the pressure on. And the suppressing fire that made all of that possible, that kept German heads down long enough for your riflemen to close the distance, came from the bar. Without the BR gunner, that cycle broke. The squad didn't just lose a weapon. It lost its ability to attack. It lost its ability to maneuver. 12 men with M1 rifles firing semi-automatically cannot generate the volume of sustained automatic fire needed to pin down a defensive position. The bar gunner was the difference between a squad that could fight its way through a hedgerow and a squad that was pinned against one. The Germans understood this completely. American unit after American unit reported the same thing. In every infantry engagement, the enemy gave immediate and priority attention to the bar. Not the officers, not the radio operators, the man with the automatic weapon. Always the man with the automatic weapon. This wasn't coincidence. It was doctrine. To understand why German snipers had standing orders to kill the BR gunner first, you have to understand something fundamental about the Wehrmacht before you can understand why eliminating that man was so important to them. The German army was built around a different philosophy than the American army. In an American rifle squad, the riflemen were the primary fighters and the bar supported them. The riflemen were the unit's core. The bar was a tool that gave them options. In a German squad, the relationship was exactly reversed. The German squad was built around the light machine gun, the MG-34 in the early war years, and later the devastating MG-42. The machine gunner was designated Schütze 1, literally infantryman number 1. He was the most important man in the squad. The rifleman existed to protect him and carry his ammunition. The machine gun was the squad's heartbeat, and everything else was organized to keep it beating. This philosophical difference had enormous tactical implications. German officers and NCOs understood better than almost anyone what happens to a squad when its automatic weapon is silenced. They had built their entire infantry doctrine around that weapon. They knew that killing the machine gunner didn't just eliminate one man, it decapitated the squad's fighting capability entirely. And when they encountered American squads in the Bocage of Normandy, in the forests of Belgium, in the snow-covered fields of the Ardennes, they looked at those 12 men and asked one question: which one is carrying the automatic rifle? Find that man. Kill that man. Kill him first. That was the standing order. The German sniper's target priority, documented in interrogation reports of captured German snipers and reflected in American after-action analyses, was clear. Enemy automatic weapon operators first, then officers and NCOs, then radio operators. The logic was cold and arithmetical. A squad without its automatic weapon was manageable. A squad without its officer was still dangerous. But a squad without its automatic weapon and its officer was nearly helpless. Start with the bar. Always start with the bar. Now step back into that hedgerow. Feel the weight of your equipment. Your boots are already wet. It rained last night, and the Norman soil holds water like a sponge. The field ahead of you is maybe 200 yards across, roughly the distance from home plate to the outfield wall. On the far side, another hedgerow, just like this one, and somewhere in that far hedgerow, or in the trees above it, or in one of the drainage ditches that run along its base, there is a man who has been waiting since before you woke up. The Norman Bocage was one of the most catastrophically unexpected environments American soldiers encountered in World War II. Military planners knew there were hedgerows in Normandy. They had aerial photographs. What they hadn't fully understood, what no photograph could convey, was what it felt like to fight in them. These were not garden hedges. The Bocage hedgerows of the Cotentin Peninsula were ancient earthen berms, some dating back to Roman times, packed with centuries of root growth and topped with dense vegetation that could be 8, 10, even 15 feet tall. They divided the landscape into hundreds of small enclosed fields, each one a separate room in a maze with no map. Tanks couldn't push through them. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. Radio communication was disrupted by the terrain. Artillery support was nearly impossible to coordinate. Everything that gave the American Army its advantages, its armor, its air power, its logistics, was neutralized by a landscape that looked from the air like patchwork farmland. For a German sniper, it was paradise. A trained German sniper, working alone or in a two-man team with a spotter, could establish a position inside a hedgerow, in a collapsed farm building, in a camouflaged dugout beneath the roots, and become functionally invisible. He could wait for hours. He had been trained to wait. German sniper doctrine emphasized patience and concealment above all else, and the Bocage rewarded both. He didn't need to shoot many times. He needed to shoot once. The right once. American commanders who survived the hedgerow battles were nearly unanimous in their assessment. The most immediate and devastating tool in the German defensive arsenal wasn't the MG-42, wasn't the 88mm gun, wasn't the Panzer. It was the individual rifleman with a telescopic sight who had been positioned in your path before you knew you were walking into it. And when that sniper's scope swept across an approaching American squad, he wasn't looking at faces. He was looking for a specific silhouette, the slightly heavier profile of the Browning automatic rifle, the bipod, the distinctive magazine, the posture of a man carrying 20 pounds of automatic firepower on his shoulder. There you are. Let's talk about who these men were, because behind the tactics and the doctrine and the strategic calculus, there were young men with names and hometowns and reasons to come home. The bar gunner in a World War II American infantry squad was typically a physically strong soldier. The weapon was heavy and punishing to carry over long distances. He was trained to a higher standard than a standard rifleman, because the bar required expertise to operate effectively. Understanding rates of fire, ammunition management, when to shoot in short controlled bursts, and when to hold fire. He was often a soldier who had shown initiative and aptitude. He was also, statistically, one of the most likely men in his squad to die. The documented average combat life expectancy of a bar gunner in World War II was estimated at approximately 30 minutes in active combat. 30 minutes. Less time than it takes to watch half of a football game. This wasn't rumor or battlefield mythology. It was a figure familiar to officers and men alike, grim arithmetic that everyone knew and nobody talked about. And yet men volunteered for the role, or accepted it when assigned. Because the bar was also the weapon that kept your buddies alive. It was the reason your rifleman could get up and run. It was what stood between your squad and being pinned down and destroyed in place. Every man who carried the bar understood at some level that he was the most important person in the squad and also the most visible. He was the man the Germans were looking for. The casualty reports tell the story in numbers. Bar gunners were killed and wounded at rates substantially higher than standard riflemen. Unit after unit, theater after theater, the pattern held. The Germans' doctrinal priority translated directly into American casualties, and the men who carried the Browning knew it every time they stepped into open ground. Medics learned to look for the bar. When a squad came back from a firefight and you wanted to know how bad it had been, you looked to see if the bar gunner was still walking. Now cross to the other side of the hedgerow. Put yourself inside a different skin. You are a German sniper, and you have been in position since 400. It's cold. The dew has soaked through your camouflage. You have not moved in 4 hours because movement is death. A skilled enemy observer can spot the disturbance of leaves, the glint of glass, the change in the shadow pattern beneath a tree. You have eaten nothing. You are not thinking about food. You are thinking about the far hedgerow, and when the Americans will come through it, and which one you will shoot first. German sniper training by mid-war had become increasingly systematic. Candidates were selected from frontline units based on marksmanship scores and psychological fitness. The ability to remain still, remain calm, and perform a precise mechanical action under conditions of extreme stress and danger. They were trained at dedicated schools in Austria and Germany, learning not just to shoot but to read terrain, to understand ammunition ballistics across distances, to construct hides that would survive a visual inspection from 20 meters. And they were trained in target priority, not as a suggestion, as doctrine. The interrogation transcripts of captured German snipers on the Western Front are consistent. Eliminate heavy weapons operators first, commanders and NCOs next. The logic, when articulated by the men themselves, was almost clinical in its clarity. One captured sniper, when asked about his target selection process, described it in terms that could have come from a field manual. You assess what the enemy's force can do without the target you are considering. If the squad cannot maneuver without this man is the priority. The bar gunner could not be replaced in the field. There was only one per squad. The rifleman could not generate his volume of fire. When the bar went silent, the American squad's tactical options collapsed to a fraction of what they had been seconds before. They could not suppress and maneuver. They could only hold ground or retreat. The sniper understood this with the cold certainty of a man who had reduced war to a series of equations. It wasn't cruelty, it wasn't even hatred, it was arithmetic. First, the bar. Always the bar. The summer of 1944 in Normandy was a masterclass in how a small number of well-positioned, well-trained defenders could impose catastrophic costs on a numerically superior force. The Germans defending the Bocage were not, in most cases, elite troops. The 352nd Infantry Division, which had savaged American forces at Omaha Beach on D-Day, had been ground down to a shadow of its former strength by early July. Many of the units holding the hedgerow positions were men who had been retreating since North Africa, veterans of defeats as well as victories, fighting now with the particular ferocity of soldiers defending terrain they knew they couldn't afford to lose. What they had, that compensated for diminished numbers, was position and knowledge. They knew every drainage ditch, every gap in every hedgerow, every line of sight across every field. They had registered their artillery on every likely avenue of approach. They had placed their snipers where the corridors between hedgerows funneled attacking infantry into pre-surveilled kill zones. and they had given their snipers a very simple, very specific, very deadly order. American after-action reports from the hedgerow fighting are painful to read. Squad after squad reports the same pattern. The unit begins an advance across open ground. The bar gunner is hit within the first moments of contact, and the advance immediately stalls. The remaining riflemen cannot generate enough suppression to advance, cannot adequately return fire on an enemy they cannot locate, and are forced to withdraw or go to ground. A position that might have been overrun in minutes, instead, holds for hours. American casualties multiply. German casualties are minimal. One senior American officer, surveying the tactical situation in late June 1944, observed that 2 German soldiers with automatic weapons in concealed positions could pin down an American company for most of a day. The mathematics of the Bocage had turned the entire Allied numerical advantage almost meaningless at the squad level. You could have 100 men in the field, but if the dozen who were supposed to take that specific hedgerow couldn't advance because their bar was down, those 100 men meant nothing. And the Germans knew it. In unit after unit, American commanders eventually drew the same lesson. They needed more bars. The Army had specified 1 per squad. Soldiers were taking them from dead men, recovering them from hospital returns, acquiring them by whatever means necessary. Some squads in the late stages of the Normandy campaign had 2 or even 3. The men called it field requisition. Their officers looked the other way. Because when you've watched your BR gunner die for the 5th time in a month, and you've watched what happens to your squad in the 30 seconds after he goes down, you understand something about this war that no training manual ever told you. The Germans were not trying to destroy your squad. They were trying to cut its spine. The soldiers who fought in the hedgerows carried what they saw for the rest of their lives. Veterans of the Normandy Bocage campaign described a particular kind of alertness, a hyper-awareness specific to that terrain, that never entirely left them. They learned to listen for the absence of sound. They learned to move differently. They learned above all that the first man into open ground was the man most likely to draw fire, and that if you were the bar gunner, you were going into open ground every time your squad needed to advance, which was every time you attacked, which was every day. The men who carried the bar developed their own informal tactics. Some learned to fire from the hip in short bursts and move immediately, never staying in one position long enough for a sniper to acquire them. Others worked out signals with their assistant gunners, the men whose job was to help carry ammunition, about which direction to break when fire came in. Some took the bipod off the weapon entirely, sacrificing stability for speed, because the extra weight was death and speed was life. None of this was in the manual. All of it was learned on the job, in the Bocage fields of Normandy, in the forest clearings of Belgium, in the frozen ground of the Ardennes, paid for with the 30-minute lives of the men who came before. There was a particular soldier, Private First Class Charles de Glopper of the 82nd Airborne, who on June 9, 1944, near the Merderet River in the Cotentin Peninsula, left the cover of a ditch with his bar and walked into open ground. Walked, not ran, firing to cover the withdrawal of his pinned platoon. He was hit multiple times. He went down. His platoon got out. He was awarded the Medal of Honor. The citation reads with the compressed language of official documentation, but what it describes is a man who understood with complete clarity what his role was and what it would cost him, and who did it anyway. He was 22 years old. He was not the first. He was not the last. From Normandy to the Hurtgen Forest to the Bulge to the Pacific Islands, the story repeated with variations. The bar gunner, the open ground, the shot that came without warning, because that was how German snipers operated. No warning, no drama, just the sudden absence of the one man the squad could least afford to lose. The Germans were good at this. They were trained to be good at it. And the fundamental logic that made the bar gunner priority number 1 was not unique to them. It was simply the oldest tactical truth in infantry warfare, articulated with ruthless efficiency. Identify what the enemy cannot function without and destroy it first. In the American Rifle Squad of 1944, that was always the man with the Browning. The Americans learned. They always learned. By late summer 1944, American infantry doctrine in the European theater had adapted substantially to the realities of the Bocage and its lessons. The Marine Corps, drawing on its Pacific experience where similar challenges had appeared in different terrain, had already arrived at a solution: restructure the squad around the bar rather than treating it as a support weapon. Build fire teams of 4 men each, with the bar as the team's primary weapon. Make suppression the default posture rather than the exception. The Army adapted more slowly, but it adapted. Units that had lost bar gunners routinely acquired additional weapons. Junior officers and NCOs who survived the hedgerow fighting brought hard-won tactical knowledge back to replacement training. New soldiers were told explicitly, sometimes by sergeants who had buried a dozen bar gunners, about the German targeting doctrine, about what to expect the moment the firing started, about what you needed to do to stay alive. You moved constantly. You never held still after firing. You changed position after every burst, every magazine, every engagement. You made the German sniper's first shot problem his entire problem, because if he had to track a moving target in the Bocage, his advantage diminished dramatically. The terrain that worked so well for a static shooter worked against a sniper chasing movement through gaps in ancient hedgerows. American commanders also learned to use the BR's distinctive sound as a tactical indicator. German defenders, interrogated after capture, acknowledged something that American soldiers had long suspected. Many German units mistook the bar for a light machine gun, which caused them to commit more resources to suppressing it than the weapon strictly required. This was a liability. It revealed position, called in artillery, but it was also, perversely, a kind of compliment. The Germans took the bar seriously enough that they sometimes overreacted to it. That told you something about what they thought of the weapon. That told you something about why they targeted the man who carried it first. Step out of the hedgerow. Come back to now. The Norman Bocage is still there. If you visit the Cotentin Peninsula today, you can stand in fields that look, in their essential structure, almost exactly as they did in the summer of 1944. The hedgerows are still ancient. The earth is still dense and old and indifferent. The drainage ditches still fill with water after rain. The fields are still enclosed, still compartmentalized, still a maze that turns a landscape into a series of rooms with no map. There are no snipers anymore. The silence is total. But if you stand at the edge of one of those fields, in that particular Norman light that seems to come from inside the clouds rather than through them, and you look across 200 yards of open ground to the far hedgerow, if you try to feel what it meant to cross that ground with a weapon on your shoulder that made you the first man any German with a telescopic sight was going to try to kill, you understand something about the nature of warfare that doesn't appear in tactical manuals. The most dangerous man in a fight is the one who makes everything else possible. And everyone in that fight, friend and enemy alike, knows who he is. He's the one carrying the bar. He's been carrying it since Normandy. He's been carrying it in Korea, in Vietnam, in every theater where American infantry advanced across ground held by someone who didn't want them there. The weapon changed. The role remained. The target on his back remained. The 30-minute clock always starts the moment he fires. If this story gave you something to think about, leave a comment below. These men deserve to be remembered, not just as statistics, but as soldiers who understood exactly what was being asked of them and said yes anyway. Subscribe for more military history told at depth. I'll see you in the next one.